breaking news in the United Kingdom: Starmer stepped down, and here is, after two, three prime minister coming, to the power, then resigning. Right now, Starmer is out. But looking at the picture of the Europe today, before coming to this live, you said the whole system is creating incompetence, which is a major statement on your part. You live in Europe, you understand the whole picture of Europe. What does that mean to the whole policy? It's not just about Starmer. You see in France, you see in Germany, but when it comes to Starmer and the outcome of that, how do you see is the influence coming out of that for the foreign policy of Europe?
Well, it's very interesting. I'm not very familiar with UK domestic policy and politics, so I will not expand too much on that. But if I just go a little bit higher and look at the big picture, we see that in the whole of Europe, we have a problem with the leadership since years. In fact, since about a decade, because that applies to France. Now, Macron has been for about 10 years in power, and it's failing. Obviously, the debt is increasing, and discontent of the population is growing. You have the same in the UK. In the UK, in the 10 years or so, you had 7 prime ministers, indicating a kind of instability, I would say a systemic instability, which is reflected in poor decisions, where foreign policy tends to override the domestic policy. You spend more money providing weapons to Ukraine rather than solving domestic and social issue within the country. You have the same thing in Germany. In Germany, you also have, I mean, just as an example, when you talk about the railways in Germany, that they used to be extremely precise and very reliable and all that. Today, it's a joke. Literally a joke. Literally, I mean, when you go in Germany, I go from time to time in Germany. I mean, I used to. Now I'm forbidden. Thank you, the European Union. I'm not allowed to go into Germany. But when I was traveling to Germany, I used to take the train. But when I used to tell that to my German counterpart, they laughed. They said, well, you dare, at least somebody who dares to take the railway, because this totally dysfunctional. You have regularly problems with the trains themselves, with the railways themselves. So everything is dysfunctional, and that's exactly the same thing. And that's, by the way, explains the rise of the AfD in Germany, which is just the so-called extreme right, or far right, which is, in my view, not. It's more like the center right than otherwise. But we don't go into the discussion of that. But the fact that the German government is spending more money preparing war than addressing domestic issues is exactly as you have in the UK. You have a system that, in fact, is driven by emotions and not driven by facts or by rationality. And that's exactly the same thing you have in the European Union itself. I mean, as I said, I was sanctioned by the European Union and by people who obviously didn't know what they were doing. And that shows exactly the kind of decision making we have in the EU, which is extremely weak. And that explains probably what you had recently in the Financial Times, where someone suggested to disband the EEAS. EEAS stands for European External Action Service, which is the equivalent of a foreign ministry in a country, but there is no ministries in the EU. This is a high representative. Kaja Kallas is the high representative for external action. And the EEAS, which has absolutely no output. It's fascinating to see that you have 5,000 people working in that institution, in the EEAS, 5,000 people. And when you talk about negotiation between US and Iran, between whoever in Palestine, for Ukraine, and all, There's the output is zero. They're absent. They have absolutely no reaction. They are totally absent of the diplomatic scene. And that shows that we spend a lot of money in institutions that are essentially ineffective and which are even counterproductive, because the regardless of how you feel about your Russia, Ukraine, Iran, or whoever, the idea, the fundamental idea of having a diplomacy is precisely to smooth the angles, to smooth the relationship, regardless of whether you like the person or not. That's where you need to have people who are dedicated to the substance, not to their own feeling. It's diplomacy, as in other areas, should be brain driven and not guts driven. And that's exactly the problem we have in the EU, but in all the countries. I mean, if we mention France, UK, and all that, this is the same problem. We are in a period where we have incompetent leaders, and the whole system promotes those incompetent leaders to come to the surface. They are very young. They have almost no experience, no life experience, probably even no working experience. They are apparatchiki, as we used to call them in the Soviet system. So they are party animals. So they grow up within the party, but they don't have a real life experience. They don't work in a factory, in a company or so. They are just growing within the party, and then they land into a ministry or things like that. And that's the case of Macron. These people who have absolutely no experience whatsoever. Merz has an experience at the head of BlackRock, but sincerely, if I were the CEO of BlackRock, I would probably not take someone like this, because you're certainly to fail at one point. But in any case, you have this kind of people that are very young, without real experience, without political experience, without ability to assess things. And we see that they are not assessing or properly through a proper analytical and intellectual process. They just tell you a narrative. Everything we decide in Europe is based on narratives, not on a rational thinking. And that's the reason why everything fails. You see, so this is no surprise. I mean, about Keir Starmer, this was predicted for since months, that he would quit because he's not up to the mark. And even when he was elected with the lowest score for the Labour Party since 1 century or so. So we know that this guy would fail, and you have the same thing with others in Europe. So that shows the quality of the leadership. I mean, if you look at the US, it's not much better. There's simply probably more experience. You have in Europe, you have inexperienced, stupid people. In the US, they are experienced. That's the only difference. But
Yeah.
we are back to the same problem. So this is always decision making, which is guts driven and not brain driven. And that's what disturbs me, the whole thing, in the whole constellation that we have.
Carol, the leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage, he just calling for a general election following the resignation of the Prime Minister Keir Starmer. But the problem is in Europe, as you mentioned, is bigger than that. They have failed to achieve their objectives in Ukraine. They're continuing. The United Kingdom is the main source of providing aid to Ukraine. They're producing drones, they're supporting Ukraine politically, geopolitically, economically, and putting pressure on they're so much connected with the establishment in the United States in terms of supporting Ukraine. Then you see the case of Middle East coming out, the West Asia, the new war coming out, and they have no power to be part of any sort of discussions. You see they're totally absent, as you mentioned, and it doesn't but it's what's shocking to me that nobody seems to care about what's going on with Europe. Where do they have their, their sort of strategic mindset? Where is that?
Well, first of all, when you talk about strategic mindset, that suggests that you should have strategy. You see, and that's the problem. We are in, and I think it's not just talking about Europe. We see that everywhere, that people think tactically. I mean, we act on day by day basis. It's not looking 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead. At best, it could be 4 years ahead because the next election are 4 years from now. That's, you see, that's at best you can achieve in Europe. So we have lost this ability to have big projects. You may, when you visit Paris, London, Rome, and other those capitals in Europe, you will see beautiful monuments, beautiful bridges, palaces, and things like this. But this was the result of people who could project their ideas on over a century or a quarter of a century, because it took a lot of time to build all this. That means that you needed to have this idea in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years in advance. And that's also what we had just after the Second World War, where you still had those visionary people who could predict what would be the country in 20 years from now, or things like that. You don't have that anymore. The people we have in the leadership today are essentially people who tweet. That means that we expect from them a response within minutes. We don't expect them to provide a response after 1 or 2 days of thinking and things like this. No, they should provide a response immediately, meaning that it's I'm not suggesting that all the projects are decided upon 5-minute decision making, but it shows a trend where we tend to want quick results, quick decisions, and we are not ready to accept to make a decision that will take effect in 20, 25 years or things like that. In other countries, and that's probably the drawback, because we have in our systems, we have democracy with electoral rhythm that is on 4 years or so. So that means that you can always project 5 years in advance, because after that, you don't know what will happen. And that's the advantage of other countries that are probably, in that sense, they provide less diversity in the leadership because people stay longer, like in Russia, like in China, like in India and others. But their advantage is that they can design project over 20 years or more, and that they have a kind of a business continuity that we tend to avoid in Europe. And that's very true when you have alternating system, when you have once it's a center right and then it's a center left and things like this. And therefore you tend, that's very obvious in France, when you have a new government, the first thing it does is to deconstruct everything the previous government has done, and therefore you restart everything from zero. And that's a lot of waste of resources, and that prevents also to have a vision over years. You see, we talk about AI and things like this. That requires, or that required in the past, years of investment. Today you have Macron, he comes and with a lot of, very proud of him, and he say we'll spend 60 million euro for develop AI. The problem is that that's exactly what US AI, ChatGPT also spend every month, or maybe every day, probably even. So we don't have this ability to see, to project our society in the future. We live in the present, and not even in the past. We tend to forget our past. So we live in the present moment, and that's the worst for a society that has no past, or refuses to look at its past, and refuses also to see the future in the long range, to have the big picture. It's always tactical moves, and strategy is not the addition of tactics. That's very important to understand. Strategy is more than the addition of tactics. And that's exactly where we fail, because by thinking tactically, or by thinking action by action, day by day, we cannot create the added value that would make the difference in 10 years or 20 years from now. That's exactly opposite of what the Chinese do. That's why they are superior. It's not just, I mean, they started with less money than we did, and probably even less a scientist or high school or whatever than we had, and less investment. But they reach more, because by looking ahead and planning on over 10 years, you can also better allocate your resources. You can also have not just the financial resources, but also your human resources. What kind of engineer will I need in 20 years from now? You see, Europe is not really producing engineers. People, if you look at countries like Belgium, also, people just want to have a paper. I mean, it needs to have a certificate, a diploma, or things like this, whatever it is, because at the end, nobody will be hired according to what is studied. Therefore, that's why you have a lot of people who study law, or political science, or social science, or things like that, things that you can use wherever, or literature, or things like that, because that's what you can use regardless of where you work. You just need to have a master's, or things like that. But that's not how you develop a society. And that's exactly, we look at countries like Belgium. Switzerland is also in a similar situation, by the way. We don't have enough physicians, for instance, because it's hard and it's long, and therefore people want to have a paper very quickly. Therefore, they study literature or things like that. They have, within 2 or 3 years, they have a master's, and that's it. So they can address the labor market with that. But that's, you don't build a society with just people having a master's in literature. That's not enough. You see, that's the problem. And we are in this kind of society today. We are not able to project ourselves in time, and that's exactly what I see when I see this all this in the UK, because that was your question initially. When you have leadership changing so often, how can you imagine to have a kind of business continuity? You cannot. And therefore, that means you cannot have a strategic consistency, strategic coherence in your decision making. And that's exactly the problem we have. And when you talk about those conflicts, Ukraine, Iran, Palestine, and other, we see that in none of this conflict, at least I could even say the US, by the way, the US and Europe, they don't have a strategy to address these questions. They are just following their guts, that's all. And those who have a strategy, they know exactly what they want to achieve, and they push towards that. And that, no wonder why Iran has probably, we can say, won this round, because it's not won the war so far, but won this round because They know exactly what they wanted. And if you look at the last version, I mean, the version that was signed of the MOU, it reflects the position of Iran it had previously. So we see that those who win are those who know where they're heading to. Those who lose are those who don't know where they want to go. And that's exactly what you have with Europe. I mean, when people when Kaya Kallas was asked about a strategy for Ukraine or for Iran or the Middle East, she said, well, there's no point having a strategy because the situation is so fluid that we cannot establish. But that's precisely because the situation is fluid that you need a strategy. That's exactly that. And then you work to implement that strategy. But now everything needs to be settled first, and then they make a strategy. This is exactly the reverse or the opposite of what should happen, and that shows this inexperience of the leadership, and that shows also why the European, I mean, not just the European, the West is failing, because when we see what's happening in for Iran, because that's the topic of the day, more or less. This is there are two different visions here. This is the vision of those who react from day to day on a day-to-day basis, and those who have a long-term vision. And those who have, as I was said before, those who have the long-term visions are the one who are more have the more chance to be successful, because you know exactly where you want to go, and you can correct your or adjust your trajectory in order to achieve the objective. When you don't know where you go, what kind of trajectory can you adjust?